The desert stretched silent under a blood-red sky, the wind carrying the dry taste of dust across the endless dunes. James Carter stirred from uneasy sleep, inside a crumbling shack, his body worn by years and his soul haunted by sins. A sharp cry pierced the night, not the wail of coyotes or owls, but the desperate cry of a child. James sat upright, heart pounding. Though he had long convinced himself his heart was dead, he whispered, "Not tonight. Not anymore." Yet the sound struck deeper than any bullet ever had, pulling him from shadows of whiskey and regret. He rose, revolver heavy at his side, boots crunching across broken boards. The cry echoed again, thin and terrified, carried on the desert wind like a ghost calling his name. James clenched his jaw, muttering, "Damn it. They never let me rest," before stepping into the moonlit dust. The desert seemed alive, holding its breath for what came next. The desert night pressed heavy around James as he walked toward the sound, the moon spilling silver light across the endless sand. His boots crunched in rhythm with his heartbeat, each step pulling him closer to something he had no wish to face. Memories clawed at him, faces he failed to protect, promises broken long ago. He muttered, "Not again. I can't." Yet the cry tore through his resistance like a bullet through glass. The air smelled of sage and smoke, as though the desert itself bore witness to old sins. James slowed, scanning the horizon, his fingers brushing the grip of his revolver, but deep inside, he knew no weapon could guard him from what stirred within his chest. The cry sharpened, carrying fear that pierced through the wind. James spotted a small figure, Daniel, huddled near jagged rocks, his tiny frame trembling. James froze, breath caught in his chest, because children's voices had haunted his dreams for years. He whispered, "Easy now, boy," though his voice cracked with rust from silence. His hand trembled as he lowered his revolver, knowing bullets could not soothe this pain. The desert seemed to lean closer, every grain of sand watching to see if he would walk away or take the step that might bury his solitude forever. The night whispered danger. From the ridge above, faint silhouettes moved, shadows stretching like wolves under the moon. James narrowed his gaze, recognizing the stance of armed men. His stomach sank because no child cried alone in such wilderness without hunters close behind. He muttered, "So that's the game," as his hand returned to the revolver's grip. Daniel whimpered softly, and James placed a steady hand near the boy, voice low, "Quiet now. They'll hear." His pulse hammered, torn between running and fighting, between saving a boy and losing himself again. The silence broke with a distant laugh carried by the wind, the kind James had heard too many times from men who took what they wanted. His body felt heavy with years of running, yet his boots planted firm in the sand. He looked down at Daniel, whose wide eyes mirrored every child James had failed, and something inside him cracked open. He whispered, "No more running," as he adjusted his stance. The revolver gleamed under moonlight, but it was not steel that weighed most. It was the choice. James Carter, once a ghost in the desert, now chose to walk back into the storm. James carried Daniel deeper into the desert, the boy trembling against his chest as silence pressed heavier than any storm. His breath was ragged, though his voice tried steady comfort. "It's all right, son. I've got you now." Yet within him, shadows clawed at memory, small hands he once failed, cries unanswered. He muttered, "Not this time," but even he doubted the strength of his own words. The moon dimmed behind clouds, and every gust of wind seemed to whisper ghosts of the past. His boots sank in sand, his arms aching from both the child's weight and his buried grief. James Carter, who had sworn never to care again, now found his heart cracking open with every whimper that slipped from Daniel's lips. By dawn, James collapsed against a sandstone boulder, the first light spilling over the desert like fire. He stared into the horizon, his eyes glazed, trapped in a memory he could never outrun. He saw himself younger, standing over graves dug by his own shaking hands, the faces of those he couldn't save burned into his mind. His fingers trembled against the revolver at his hip as he whispered, I walked away once, and it cost me everything." Daniel stirred beside him, clutching James' sleeve in half-sleep, anchoring him in the present. For the first time in years, James felt the weight of choice, whether to keep walking or fall back into the pit of silence he had called life. The silence broke with a cheerful but stubborn voice calling from behind. Emma Walker, bright-eyed and restless, trotted toward them with a rifle slung clumsily across her shoulder. James groaned, muttering, "Hell, not you." Emma smirked. "You look like you could use someone who hasn't given up yet." James glared, but the fire in her words stung truth. Daniel peeked nervously from behind James, curiosity mixing with fear. Emma knelt, her eyes softening at the boy's frightened face. She said, "Don't worry, kid, I don't bite." James muttered under his breath, "No, you just rush headlong into trouble." Yet a part of him knew he needed her fire, even if it burned him too. Later that day, in the ruins of an old way station, a figure stepped from the shadows, Clara Hayes, her dress out of place against the grit of the desert. Her eyes held secrets sharp as blades. James stiffened, muttering, "You never belonged here." Clara smiled faintly, voice like honey, laced with venom. "And yet here I am, James." Daniel clung tighter to his sleeve, sensing the tension. Emma's hand crept toward her rifle, mistrust plain. Clara's gaze lingered on the boy, then back to James, a flicker of recognition betraying her calm. She said softly, "You don't know what storm you've stepped into." James' jaw tightened. He had seen storms before, but never one tied to her. As the sun bled into dusk, the three travelers reached the outskirts of town. The wooden structure stood under the shadow of authority, Sheriff Donovan's mark etched into every building. James' eyes narrowed, muttering, "He's still choking the life out of this place." Daniel clutched his hand tighter, sensing the weight of unspoken history. Emma spat in the dust, "Then let's choke him back." Clara only smirked, gaze unreadable, though the flicker in her eyes revealed she knew more than she admitted. The people of the town avoided James' stare, as though recognizing a ghost returned. The cry of a child had dragged him back, but Donovan's grip on the land promised only blood. The old church stood broken on the edge of town, its wood gray with age, its cross leaning like a forgotten sentinel. Inside, James found Henry Thompson, his former mentor, seated in shadows. Henry's eyes, tired and sharp, pierced through James like a rifle shot. "You shouldn't have come back," Henry said, voice rough as gravel. James smirked bitterly, "Never meant to." Daniel peeked timidly from behind James, and Henry's gaze softened. "You carrying the past again, son? Thought I taught you better." James clenched his jaw, silence heavy, for Henry had taught him everything: shooting, survival, even regret. Yet the old man's warning carried more weight than the years themselves, a reminder that violence never left without a price. The sheriff's office loomed over the dusty street, polished wood and cold steel shining under noon sun. Sheriff Donovan emerged, tall and stern, his badge gleaming as if it commanded the whole town. His voice rang out, "James Carter, back from the dead are you?" James stood silent, his hand brushing Daniel's shoulder, protective but unreadable. Emma scowled, hand tightening on her rifle strap. Donovan's smirk spread, his voice dripping authority. "This town belongs to the law, and the law belongs to me." Townsfolk scattered, doors slamming, windows closing, as though every soul feared the man's shadow. James muttered low, "I've seen men like you fall before." Yet deep down he knew Donovan's grip was far from weak. The ambush came swift on the edge of town. Gunfire cracked like thunder, bullets sparking off stone as riders stormed in with dust trailing their horses. James shoved Daniel behind a trough, shouting, "Stay down!" His revolver barked, each shot a memory of a life he swore to leave behind. Emma darted into cover, firing wildly, her determination sharper than her aim. Clara moved like a shadow, slipping behind crates, her expression unreadable. James' blood roared in his ears, every shot echoing past battles, past regrets. When silence fell, only smoke and bodies remained. James stood, chest heaving, the weight of violence pressing heavy on his shoulders again. He whispered, "Hell follows me wherever I go." Night fell heavy, the smell of smoke still clinging to the streets. Emma paced in anger, her youthful defiance burning brighter than the lanterns. "We can't keep running, James," she snapped. James' eyes darkened, voice cold. "You don't know what running costs." "I do." Daniel sat quietly nearby, his eyes wide, clutching a scrap of cloth for comfort. Emma's fists trembled, her words shaking. "If you won't fight for him, then I will." James stepped closer, his shadow towering, but his voice cracked. "You'll get yourself killed, girl." Her glare cut through him, a reminder that fire could be born even in the young. In her stubbornness, James saw the part of himself he had buried, and it frightened him. Clara leaned against the rail of the saloon porch, her figure half hidden in shadow, watching James with eyes that revealed nothing. When he approached, her lips curved in a faint smile. "You don't trust me," she said. James replied, "Trust is a luxury I buried long ago." Daniel peeked out from behind him, uncertain of her. Clara's gaze softened, almost tender, but it flickered with secrets. "The boy changes everything," she whispered, her tone caught between warning and confession. James searched her eyes for truth, but found only storms. Emma's glare from across the street said it all. Clara was trouble. Yet James knew trouble had a way of choosing him, and Clara's storm was pulling closer by the hour. The night air grew heavy in the abandoned barn, dust swirling like ghosts in the lantern's glow. Daniel sat silent, his eyes wide, his small hands clinging to James' coat. Then Clara's voice cut through the silence, calm yet piercing. "You don't even know who he is, do you, James?" James froze, his hand tightening on his revolver. Clara's eyes held no mercy as she whispered, "That boy carries your blood." Daniel looked up, confusion flooding his face, while James staggered back, muttering, "That's impossible." The barn seemed to shrink around him, walls pressing in as his past collided with the present. He had buried family with the desert sands, yet here was a voice insisting fate had never let go. Sheriff Donovan's words struck like a bullet when he confronted James outside the saloon. His voice dripped with satisfaction. "Thought you'd left it all behind, Carter? That boy is your curse, same as you left behind years ago." James' fists clenched, rage twisting inside him. Donovan smirked, his polished badge gleaming under lamplight. "Your bloodline's tied to sins this town hasn't forgotten, and I made sure they paid for your weakness." James' breath turned to fire as he realized Donovan was not just his enemy. He had been the architect of his loss, the shadow behind every ghost that haunted him. Daniel's presence was no accident. Donovan had pulled the strings from the start. Later, in the quiet of the stable, Clara's mask slipped. She leaned close to James, her eyes heavy with conflict. "I never wanted it to be this way," she whispered. James' gaze cut sharp, his voice bitter. "You chose his side." Clara's lips trembled, then steadied. "Donovan owns me, but I tried to keep you alive, James. Tried to keep the boy hidden." Daniel's gaze darted between them, innocence drowning in secrets too heavy for his years. Emma stepped forward, fury burning. "She's lying, James. She's playing us all." James stood silent, the storm raging inside. Clara's tears glistened, her voice breaking. "I've already lost too much. Don't make me lose him too." James turned to Henry in desperation, his voice breaking through clenched teeth. "Tell me it isn't true." The old man lowered his gaze, shame carving deeper lines into his scarred face. "I should have told you, son. Long ago." James staggered back, the betrayal heavier than any bullet. Henry's voice quivered. "I was there when Donovan struck. I knew, and I kept silent. I thought it would spare you." James' fists shook, fury warring with grief, as Daniel's small hand slipped into his. Henry's eyes glistened, his voice raw. "I wanted to protect you from yourself, James, but in doing so, I failed you both." The truth was an open wound neither could close. The desert wind howled through the silent street as James stood between past and present, fury rising with the dust. Clara lingered in shadow, Emma braced with defiance. Henry bowed with regret, and Donovan's influence loomed across every board of the town. James' voice cut through the night, raw and certain. I can't run from this anymore. Daniel's hand tightened in his fragile yet steady. The storm inside James finally gave way to resolve. Redemption was no longer a dream buried under whiskey and regret. It demanded fire, blood, and sacrifice. He stepped into the street, shoulders squared, his shadow stretching wide across the desert ground. The reckoning had begun. The street exploded in chaos as Donovan's men stormed through, rifles blazing, lanterns shattering into fire. James shoved Daniel behind a water trough, his revolver barking with deadly precision. Emma fired from the rooftops, her youth lit by reckless courage, while Clara ducked into shadows, her loyalties unreadable. Henry staggered into the fray, shotgun booming with old fury, but age weighed on his bones. The town's cries mixed with gunfire, dust rising like smoke from hell itself. James' voice roared above the din. Hold the line! Yet inside he knew each bullet carved deeper into the grave he'd tried to leave behind. The fight was not just against Donovan's men, but against the ghost of the man he once was. When silence finally fell, the street was littered with blood and broken wood. Emma stumbled down from the rooftop, clutching her side where a bullet had grazed her. James rushed forward, rage burning in his eyes. Damn it, girl, I told you not to rush. Emma gritted her teeth, smirking through pain. Better me than the boy. Daniel's wide eyes filled with tears as he knelt beside her, whispering, Don't die. Clara stood nearby, her face unreadable, though her gaze lingered with something softer than before. Henry leaned against a broken wall, his breath heavy, muttering, This fight's tearing us apart. James looked at Emma, realizing her fire came at a price, and he carried the guilt of letting her pay it. The next day Donovan's iron grip closed tighter. His deputies marched the streets, guns at every corner, fear stamped into every face. Townsfolk whispered as James passed, calling him both savior and curse. Donovan stood at the gallows, his booming voice echoing, This town is mine, and any who defy me will swing. James watched from shadow, Daniel clinging close, his small hand trembling. Emma leaned weakly against him, her wound slowing her, but her fire unbroken. Clara slipped through the crowd, her eyes sharp, carrying secrets like blades. Henry muttered, He's turning fear into law. James' jaw tightened. If Donovan had the town's soul, then James would have to decide how much blood it was worth to take it back. That night, James sat by the dying fire, Daniel asleep against his chest. Emma watched from across the flames, her wound wrapped but her spirit unyielding. She whispered, You can't keep both vengeance and the boy. James' eyes burned with conflict, voice low. If I don't end Donovan, he'll never be safe. Clara appeared from the darkness, her tone soft yet dangerous. And if you do, James, will he still know a father, or just another killer? Henry puffed at his pipe, silence heavy. James' hand brushed the revolver at his side, the weight colder than the desert night. The fire's embers glowed like judgment, each spark a reminder that every path led to loss. The betrayal came swift. As dawn broke, Clara stood apart, her eyes locked on James with sorrow. Donovan's men emerged from the ridges, rifles drawn. Emma shouted, She led them here. James' heart sank as Clara's tears glistened. I never wanted this, she cried, her voice breaking. Daniel clutched James' hand in terror as Henry raised his shotgun with a roar. Gunfire erupted, the desert exploding with violence once again. James' heart thundered with fury, torn between survival and the crushing weight of Clara's choice. Her face, caught between love and betrayal, seared itself into his memory as blood and dust consumed the dawn. The cost of violence had come due, and there was no turning back. Dawn crept across the desert, painting the town in pale fire. James sat alone on the church steps, revolver heavy in his hands. Henry approached, his gait slow, burdened by years of war and regret. He lowered himself beside James, voice calm but rough. You don't have to walk this road. James' eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, voice cold as stone. It's already walking toward me. Henry sighed, the weight of his choices pressing down. You can still choose who you are when the gunsmoke clears. James tightened his grip on the revolver, feeling Daniel's small presence in the distance. Redemption and ruin both waited in the same street, and the sun would decide which one claimed him. The street emptied as the sun climbed higher, silence settling heavier than chains. Donovan stepped into the open, his polished boots striking dust, badge glinting like a curse. James emerged opposite, Daniel and Emma watching from the shadows. Donovan smirked, voice carrying sharp. Back where you belong, Carter, facing the law you could never outrun. James' jaw tightened, his voice low. This isn't law. This is you. The two men stood in stillness, the desert air humming, every eye hidden behind shuttered windows. Emma whispered to Daniel, "This is what it all comes to." The boy's small hand clutched hers, eyes wide, as the world narrowed to two men, and the fate they carried between them. Daniel's cry shattered the silence. "Don't go." His voice carried desperation that pierced through shuttered doors and trembling hearts. James turned his head for a fleeting moment, his eyes softening as he saw the boy's fear. Donovan chuckled coldly, "Even your blood knows you're a failure." James' chest heaved, fury pressing against sorrow. Emma pulled Daniel back, whispering fiercely, "Stay quiet, trust him." James steadied his breath, turning his gaze back to Donovan, revolver hand loosening, then tightening again. In that moment, James was no longer running, no longer drowning in ghosts. He was standing as both outlaw and father, a man facing the weight of blood and the shadow of his own reflection in the enemy before him. The duel stretched into eternity before the first move. Sweat rolled down James' temple. The revolver steady, but his heart torn between vengeance and mercy. Donovan's eyes gleamed with arrogance, his hand twitching near his holster. The town held its breath, every window shutter trembling with unseen eyes. James whispered under his breath, "This ends now." The boy's face flashed before him, the memory of graves, the sting of betrayal, the echo of Clara's tears, every ghost circling at once. Donovan's sneer widened, his hand snapping for his weapon. James drew, faster than breath, the crack of thunder splitting the noon silence. The desert swallowed the sound, leaving only the echo of choice ringing through the dusk. Donovan staggered, his revolver clattering to the dirt as blood bloomed across his chest. His eyes widened, rage collapsing into disbelief, before he fell heavy into the dust. James stood frozen, chest heaving, revolver smoking in his hand. Daniel ran forward, clutching his arm, crying, "You're still here." Emma's face lit with relief, though her body trembled from pain and exhaustion. Henry watched from the church steps, nodding solemnly. Clara lingered at the edge of the street, her eyes wet, a storm of betrayal and sorrow. James looked to the boy, then to the revolver, his voice low and broken. "No more running." The desert wind carried his words as Donovan's shadow finally fell. The town lay silent after the storm, smoke rising from broken beams, the air thick with the echo of gunfire. James stood in the street, staring at Donovan's body sprawled in the dust. Townsfolk emerged from their hiding places, faces pale with fear and fragile hope. Henry stepped forward, resting a heavy hand on James' shoulder. "It's done," he said softly, though both knew the cost would linger. Emma sat on the steps of the saloon, her wound bound tight, her eyes fierce but weary. Daniel clung to James, refusing to let go, his voice a whisper, "We made it." James nodded, though his eyes held sorrow deeper than victory, knowing survival always came with scars. At the edge of the street, Emma stood tall despite the pain, her rifle resting against her shoulder. Her face, still young, carried new lines carved by loss and fire. She looked at James and said, "We can't waste what was bought here." James met her gaze, pride mixing with fear. Daniel looked up at her, eyes wide, whispering, "You're brave." Emma smirked faintly, though her voice was firm. Brave costs blood, boy, don't forget it. James saw in her the spark of the fighter he once was, but different, less haunted, more unyielding. She had stepped into a fire that would shape her forever, and he knew her path would no longer be shadowed by his alone. Sheriff Donovan's deputies fled or dropped their badges in the dust. The gallows he had built stood empty, a monument to his greed. Townsfolk gathered, tearing down his banners, their voices trembling with relief. Henry leaned against the church rail, his voice carrying over the hush. His law dies with him. Yet James knew scars would linger longer than freedom. Daniel clung tighter, sensing the unease. Clara watched from the shadows of the saloon, her expression unreadable, torn between guilt and longing. The people looked to James, their eyes searching for a leader, but his gaze drifted away. He had given them blood, but leadership was a weight he could no longer bear. Later, in the quiet desert beyond town, James sat by the campfire, Daniel asleep at his side. Emma leaned against a wagon wheel, her rifle resting nearby. Clara approached cautiously, her eyes glistening with regret. "You'll never forgive me," she whispered. James' gaze stayed on the flames, his voice low and raw. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give anymore." She nodded, her face heavy with sorrow, then turned into the night, swallowed by shadows. Henry spoke softly from the dark. "Every man chooses his end. You just chose his." James looked at Daniel, small and fragile, yet the only anchor left to his heart. The fire crackled, sparks rising like ghosts into the starry sky. At dawn, James stood at the edge of the desert, Daniel's hand in his. The boy looked up with wide eyes, asking softly, "Where do we go now?" James gazed into the endless horizon, his voice steady but heavy. "Forward." Emma watched from town, her figure framed by morning light, strong despite scars. Henry sat by the church, pipe smoke curling like prayers into the air. Clara was gone, leaving only silence where her shadow lingered. James tightened his grip on the boy's hand and stepped into the rising sun. The desert wind howled behind them, carrying whispers of blood, loss, and redemption. For the first time in years, James Carter walked not as a ghost, but as a man who chose to rise.